big day of school today. Did you do all your homework?
39-year-old project manager Anthony House is getting his daughter ready for school.
Anthony is my brother, not biological. His mother took me in as another family member. His name was Anthony, but all the friends and family call him Stephen. When I was in a foster home and I used to get ridiculed for having like hand-me-down clothes or cheap clothes, Stephen would give me his newer clothes so I wouldn't get ridiculed, and he helped me with my school, he helped me with my class. Stephen was really good at everything. He was really good at academics, always had A's. All the girls liked him.
Mom should be down soon. Still gotta brush your teeth.
When Stephen's daughter was born, he became extremely family-oriented, extremely protective, and everything that he did was for his family. His daughter was number one in everything. Typical morning for Stephen.
Have a great day at school.
His wife, get up, go to work.
All right, bye. I'll see you later.
And he gets the baby up, takes her to school.
Care.
Thanks.
See you later.
Austin 911, do you need police, fire, or
There was an explosion.
Okay, tell me exactly what happened.
We don't know. We heard an explosion and my neighbors were outside on the ground.
911, do you need
Hey,
fire?
I don't know what's going on. My neighbor, something exploded or something. There's blood everywhere. We need an ambulance immediately.
The calls were placed by neighbors who had heard the explosion but didn't know how it had occurred. So, as you can imagine, it was pretty frantic. When officers arrived on scene, that's when they discovered that Anthony House was laid out on the front porch. Obviously, he sustained traumatic injuries. He had shrapnel injuries, not only to his torso, but also to his hand and to his foot. Anthony House was transported to the hospital. So they're trying to put these pieces together to determine, is it a car that backfired? Is it an electrical outlet or something that had exploded? When I arrived on scene, we could see the devastation that had been created by this pretty significant explosion.
Can you tell me what happened?
Not only had Anthony Stephen House sustained this blast injuries on the front step, but his daughter was inside the residence when this had occurred.
His daughter was at a safe distance and has escaped injury.
Did she see anything?
Talking to the neighbors,
Hi. Can you tell me what you saw?
we were able to establish, in fact, that one of them had saw a package that was on the doorstep of Anthony Stephen House's residence. You can see that there was blood all over the stoop, as well as shrapnel. There were sheet metal screws, nails, there were batteries, as well as twisted pieces from galvanized pipe. So this was a man-made explosion and was intentional. We located small shreds from the cardboard box in which the pipe bomb had been placed. So the package was the origin of the bomb blast. Something like this is just unprecedented. We'd never seen this before in Austin. We didn't have a lot of experience dealing with bomb explosions. This is the only homicide that I'd ever had that involves an actual bomb. We're going into this blind, trying to now put these pieces together to determine why did this happen? Why was Anthony House selected? And why was this bomb placed on his doorstep?
Doctors are unable to save Anthony House. He dies within an hour of the blast.
His wife and Mom were at the hospital, his daughter was with them, she was safe. They knew that something has happened to Stephen, but no one would tell him what.
There are a wide range of emotions that go through making a death notification to inform them that their loved one had passed.
When they said he passed, they were destroyed and devastated. It just didn't make any sense. To hear that he lost his life, it was shocking, it was appalling, and it was painful, but the only thing I could think of was his daughter. I couldn't even get past how she may feel because I knew that their relationship was one. They were one. That was his best friend. And I knew that now she would not have him.
Detectives did talk to them to determine if there was anyone out there that potentially wanted to cause him harm or had ill intent. But we were not able to establish any lead that would suggest that somebody intended to cause him harm. We're going to do everything within our power to try to determine who was responsible for this and bring them to justice. Early on, we did look at surveillance video footage from neighbors who lived on that street. You know, doorbell cameras or cameras that were, posted above somebody's garage that potentially could have captured an individual or a vehicle as they passed through that neighborhood within that time frame.
Show me what you've got. Fast forward.
We're going through the surveillance video footage and trying to determine if there's anybody that appeared to be out of place.
Is there any other footage? Play that bit again. Zoom in. Who's that?
There were a number of individuals walking through the neighborhood. But the individuals that we identified on the surveillance video footage were persons that lived in that actual neighborhood.
Investigators talked to residents seen on the surveillance footage.
We'd go door to door, basically gumshoeing it, determine if anybody was deemed to be suspicious.
We're investigating a homicide?
But the individuals that we identified had a valid reason for being there.
Okay.
So it ended up being a dead end.
Investigators turned to the evidence left at the crime scene.
The ATF were brought in to look at the actual bomb-making materials to determine where these components had been purchased from and when. We were hopeful that there were going to be cameras at the stores that may have captured the individual, and we would be able to identify the person responsible.
Tracing the components is their only lead, and is a slow process.
Mr. 911, can you please fire EMS? Oh, I need a EMS, please. Okay, tell me what happened. Something exploded in the house, and my husband is bleeding everywhere.
A second explosion has rocked Austin, Texas.
An explosion had taken place on Old Fort Hill Drive. We didn't know at that particular time if it was going to be connected to the other bombing or not, because we had a period of 10 days that had passed in between the two.
So what can you tell me?
17-year-old Draylon Mason had picked up a package that was located on the front porch of his residence and had carried it inside to the dining room table where his mother was at and proceeded to open it up. And when they did, that's when that bomb exploded. It was a pretty significant explosion. It ended up killing Draylon Mason there at that residence.
Draylon's mother, Shamika, is rushed to the hospital.
We were able to determine that there were similarities between the two bombs. the nails, the sheet metal screws, as well as clothespins, mouse traps, and type of batteries that were used.
Law enforcement need to trace components of both bombs to stores with surveillance cameras.
They were bombs placed inside of cardboard boxes, so we knew definitively there was going to be a link between them. We had 2 victims, both African-American males, so we're wondering now, is this potentially a hate crime? That's where we looked at bringing in the FBI.
Draylon Mason's mom, Shamika, comes out of surgery.
We were able to go see my godmother in the hospital room. My Aunt Shawn, my godmother's oldest sister, she told her that Draylon didn't make it. And then just the cry, the scream, like it was something I'll never forget. I felt heavy. I felt my heart drop. I felt my stomach just drop.
It was just too much. It was too much for a long time. I said, God got some explaining to do, because I don't understand. I was like, Draylon never hurt anybody. He just wasn't a mean kid. He didn't know how to be.
Draylon was a unique young man, very talented. When he had an instrument in his hand, he was in his element. He was on the zone. He loved it. There's no other feeling except that, like, we were robbed. We lost a star, in my opinion.
While investigators gather surveillance video from the neighborhood, police receive another call.
Do you need police, fire, or EMS?
I heard an explosion. I don't know what happened.
Merely hours later, we received notice of a 3rd bombing at 11:50 a.m., and that occurred on Galindo Street.
The fire and EMS got there very quickly. It's another outside explosion, which means we have a crime scene of hundreds of feet.
When I arrived, obviously there was quite a bit of devastation. It occurred in the roadway, and we had debris up and down the street for several hundred yards. Esperanza Herrera had actually picked up a package that was addressed to a residence across the street. And when she picked this up, again, the detonation went off. She sustained significant shrapnel injuries to her left leg in this blast. I took a spray paint can, and every time I came across a piece of potential debris, I ended up spraying a circle around it. We came across pieces of the cardboard box in which the pipe bomb had been placed. We also located nails, sheet metal screws, and we also came across AC Delco AA batteries.
We were very, very confident that all 3 of these devices were actually made by the same bomber. We have a serial bomber.
We looked at surveillance cameras that were in the vicinity, particularly interested in any video footage that would capture people walking through the neighborhood or driving through the neighborhood before or after. We were hopeful with the cameras that we would be able to identify the person that was responsible or the vehicle that they had traveled in. So on March 18th of 2018, at about 6:50 p.m., there's a 911 call that came in. 2 Caucasian males in their early 20s been riding bicycles up near a neighborhood park, and an explosion had taken place.
5506 UOD. We have a confirmed shrapnel.
They were very significantly injured, and thank goodness the fire department and EMS were there very quickly and were able to get them to the hospital and save their lives.
The initial officers arrived on scene, recognized this monofilament line across the sidewalk.
It's a tripwire.
The bomb was placed behind a sign that said, "Drive like your kids live here." What concerned us there was the complexity that now we're into tripwires, the complete randomness. Didn't make a difference who was walking down that street. That was a white neighborhood, so it kind of throws the hate crime piece out of that as well. Obviously, we're concerned because every day now, every other day, there's a bomb going off. But now we have another piece to start looking at. Where would you get that sign? Where would you buy something like that?
We were looking for any video footage of the individual purchasing the sign.
But that is a very long process. Unfortunately, it takes longer than anybody really wants.
A couple days after that, on the early morning hours of March 20th, we received notification from the FedEx shipping facility south of Austin, just north of San Antonio, that a bomb had exploded.
We had an explosion in one of their warehouses and part of their production line there.
Thankfully, there was nobody in the vicinity at the time, so no one was actually injured. But we immediately shut that facility down.
The best part was that FedEx was able to say to us, we can track that package to where it was mailed.
This package that exploded, it actually originated from a FedEx shipping facility on Brody Lane in South Austin. And it was crucial then that we go to that facility to see if there's potential for surveillance video footage that may have captured the individual who mailed this package. When we arrived, we were able to establish that the facility had an interior camera, and we're hoping that we're going to capture him on film and be able to definitively say this is the person that was responsible for delivering the bombs.
Show me what you got.
We knew that was going to be a treasure trove of evidence.
So let's see the camera above the door from just before the package was scanned.
They view images captured by the CCTV.
Who's that? Is that him?
So in watching the surveillance video footage, I'm able to see this individual as he actually comes in through the door. We see he's got a hat on. He's got what appears to be long blonde hair.
Punch in there.
He's wearing a shirt that's got a graphic on it. He's also wearing gloves that have pink rubber tips on the gloves themselves. Obviously, he's not wanting to leave any identifiable fingerprints or DNA behind.
He was wearing gloves, but we could tell it's a white male. How tall he is, the build he had. There was great excitement because we knew that's the guy. And we knew we have something to go on.
What else have you got?
He walks from that doorway up to the counter and proceeds to mail those packages.
Okay, zoom in.
The poor FedEx person that received the packages is flipping them over, reading barcodes. It's chilling to think of what could have happened right then and there. What if that bomb had gone off at the FedEx store?
Oh, God. There's another package.
I noticed that he mailed 2 packages from that location. One that exploded, and we still needed to track the other package.
Can you find out where that package is?
It was an awful sinking feeling to know that they could end up anywhere, in the United States. I had no idea who the intended targets were or how long these packages were going to be in transit and who else was in harm's way. We needed to find the other package.
FedEx raced to track down the parcel, while investigators attempt to identify the suspect.
So that initial video gets us to interview the FedEx employee.
It was important to speak to the clerk because he actually had face-to-face contact with the Austin serial bomber. Up to this point in time, we didn't have that.
We were wondering what you could tell us about this man.
He was able to provide me with detailed head-to-toe description of this male, and he indicated that the long blonde hair was actually a wig. obviously went to extremes to alter his appearance.
Do you remember anything else?
The FedEx employee then says to us that the subject, he smelled funny. He smelled like chemicals.
Did you happen to notice the vehicle he drove in?
The employee says, well, he was so strange that after he left, I went to the door and looked, and I could see that he parked a couple of stores down.
The individual parked his red Ford Ranger pickup truck in an adjacent parking lot close to Party City. He watched him drive off in that vehicle.
Agent Combs' team acquire the Party City video footage to find out if they have caught the suspect's car on camera.
Open up the footage from the parking lot. Let's go back to 10 minutes before the package was delivered. That's it. Rewind.
We could see that it's a red pickup truck with an open bed.
Can you punch that in?
A lot of these businesses will lower the quality of the video footage so that they can store much more footage over time. Unfortunately, we were not able to see a license plate.
Looks like a Ford Ranger.
But now we have something really tangible to go on. You know, we know he's in a red truck. Let's start investigating the truck. We went to the state police and asked them for the registration of every person within 100 miles of Austin that owned that type of truck. So now we have a list. Now we have names.
Go through those vehicles, cross-reference with everything we have so far.
In Texas, there are hundreds of people who own a red truck within the Austin 100-mile radius. It takes time. It's not fast. You have to be studious. You have to pay attention to detail, and you can start working that list down.
Combs, it's FedEx. Did you find it?
FedEx was able to tell us that they had found the second package that the subject had mailed.
In fact, they were able to tell us that the other package was actually in the process of being loaded onto a truck at a FedEx facility just outside of Austin-Bergstrom International Airport.
Everyone needs to get out. Lock that place down now.
Time was absolutely of the essence. They absolutely needed to lock it down because potentially there was another bomb that was being loaded onto that truck. It was putting other people in harm's way.
Did you get it in time?
They had isolated it so nobody could get hurt. So we knew that the package was safe. It was in a warehouse, and we would be the first people to actually touch that package.
We had individuals from FBI and ATF go there with a portable X-ray scanner where they were able to scan the package and confirm that there was an undetonated pipe bomb inside that package.
To have an explosive device built and not exploded really can give you a bonanza of evidence.
It's now been 2 weeks since the bomb struck Draylen's home.
It's unnatural for a child to go before a parent. I was struggling, dealing with the devastation. Everybody sees Draylen as this phenomenal, person that they see him as this musician and he's just all these things. He applied to Oberlin Music Conservatory. His bass teacher helped him for that audition. 2 weeks after he died, he was accepted into Oberlin. They only take 170 students, and he got the spot. The one thing he was waiting for, he never knew he got it. It just tore me up.
Law enforcement pieced together clues from all of the bombings.
Through the course of the investigation, we were looking for any components that were unique So in researching the gloves that he was observed wearing in the FedEx facility on Brody Lane, we were able to determine that those gloves can only be purchased from Home Depot. And the sign that he had used, that says, "Drive like your children live here," we were able to get the universal product code on the back side of that sign and establish that it could also only be purchased from a Home Depot. Now, there are a number of Home Depots in the Austin area and just outside of Austin, but we're able to go to each one of those locations and say, when was this sign last purchased? And in fact, it had been purchased from Home Depot in Round Rock, just north of Austin. We were able to determine that this sign had been purchased in conjunction with the gloves that we saw him wearing.
This is the only instance of that sign and those gloves being bought in one single purchase.
We were closing in on the suspect, and we knew that it was just a matter of time before we were able to identify and capture him.
Investigators request the surveillance footage from the time of the purchase.
When those videos came in from the Home Depot store, it was exciting. It was exciting to see that we're finally on to something.
Let's go to the camera over the register. Play it. There it is.
Immediately, I can see him walking out of the aisle, and he's got the full sign in his hand. It says, "Drive like your children live here."
Punch in there. Damn, can't make him out.
It's not a great picture of his face, but you can see him checking out with the sign.
Play that part again.
You could tell his height. You could tell his weight. You could tell the way he walked.
Can you bring up the image from FedEx?
You could tell from the video that definitely the guy at Home Depot is the same guy at FedEx. It's somewhat chilling because you know you have a mass murderer, you have a bomber. He's walking around Home Depot buying pieces right next to normal people who have no idea who they're standing next to.
So he's exited, so go to the exterior camera. There he is.
We were able to track this individual after he had purchased this sign and made his way out to the parking lot.
Where's he gone? Wait, is that the same truck?
He actually got into a red pickup truck with an open bed.
Bring up the truck from FedEx.
That same pickup truck is the pickup truck that we observed the individual getting into at the Party City right after he'd mailed the packages from the FedEx on Brody Lane.
Can you punch in on the plate?
Although it's great getting video, it's never as good as you want it to be. So you would assume between all these cameras, you'd get a license plate. We had no license plate.
Yeah? They traced the battery packs.
We were able to determine that these battery packs are something specific to Fry's Electronics, that they're sold by the dozens.
One of the FBI analysts was going through receipts of people that bought batteries, would take those receipts, run it against who owns red trucks, and then pull up their driver's license. And by luck, within about 8 names of hundreds we had, the analyst pulls up the driver's license, sees he has a red truck.
The detectives checked the receipt for the date, time, and Fry's store the batteries were bought from.
And we obtained surveillance video footage that was captured from the Fry's Electronics store.
Play it.
They had an interior camera which captured this individual when he actually exited the store.
Pause it there.
There was a great picture of his face. The analyst pulls up the driver's license photo and compares that to the video we had.
Got him.
And then that's the first time we knew we had a name. We had who the bomber was.
When this individual made the purchase of the battery packs from the Fry's Electronics, he used a credit card. And that credit card was in the name of Mark Anthony Condit.
So once we have him identified, we sent surveillance teams to his house. We saw the red truck at the house.
We put a game plan together where we were actually going to execute a search and arrest warrant at the residence. But we were fearful that the residence potentially could be booby-trapped.
The order was given, if he leaves that house, you're going to take him down, because he could be leaving to mail a device. But we didn't know if he was in that house or not.
There's no sign of any movement inside the residence.
So we continued to look at other avenues as well. Where is he? Where could he possibly be?
We're trying to establish his potential whereabouts. And one of the things that we would typically do is track his cell phone. But we were not able to come across any activity from his phone. I mean, it was silent at that point in time, so we really did not know where he was at. But then I received notification that he had activated his phone and was live. Agents were able to track his phone to a parking lot of a hotel in the Round Rock area.
And the decision was made that the Austin SWAT team would be the tactical team that would take him down.
We actually had 2 fixed-wing planes that were in the area circling, watching his vehicle.
Mark Condit is inside a parked SUV.
We were concerned that his truck was going to be booby-trapped.
Air to ground, he's on the move, backing out now.
He started moving. He backed out of the parking space and began moving towards the interstate. The SWAT team followed him.
I got him eastbound, gonna be taking a right turn southbound.
When his car left the parking lot and started to go down the access road to the highway, the order was...
take him down before he hits that highway.
Because the chances of losing him or hurting other people are just too high.
We're 35 frontage and Old Settlers, and he's red ball. He's stopped right now. All right, we're through the intersection, southbound, still on frontage.
As he's making his way towards the interstate, the SWAT commander came over the radio.
Yeah, roger that, off screen.
And directed a vehicle assault. The 2 SWAT vehicles separated. One got in front of his truck, the other one behind him, and essentially boxed him in. The SWAT truck following was able to ram him into a little culvert between the frontage road and the interstate.
All right, Vans made contact with him. Vans made contact with him.
SWAT members bailed out of the vehicle, ran up to the truck on the passenger side.
Got an explosion inside the vehicle.
I hear them say detonation, and then the radio was just eerily silent.
Tango 19er, come in.
Once he realized that he was being arrested, he detonated an explosive device in the car. When we saw that explosion go off, I think all of us felt, oh my God, how many police did we just lose? By the grace of God, very few injuries, very minor injuries. And they came on the radio and told us, subject is dead. We're pulling back, because they didn't know if there were any more devices in that car. So once the bomber kills himself, we execute a search warrant at his house.
We'd actually entered through the bedroom window into his room, rather than going through the door, because we thought potentially it could be booby-trapped. We could see that there were a number of electronic devices, batteries, cellular telephones, wires.
There's the wig.
As well as disguises. He had a glow vest and a hard hat. Potentially he had worn that when he was in one of these neighborhoods, so he was able to move freely in and out. We also located a significant amount of ammonium nitride. There was no question that he had significant plans to kill or injure additional people.
And we also found a confession video that he had made literally moments before the SWAT team had stopped him. It's dark, so you actually don't see the video, but you can hear the audio very clearly, in which he goes through each bombing to date, and he discusses why he did them. There was some controversy as far as releasing publicly the confession video that the bomber made. Our concern was, if that video was released, it lived forever on the internet. It could certainly inspire other people, and we certainly don't want to give a voice to murderers. What was really chilling about this video is that he's just so matter-of-fact, no emotion, clearly says, I just love killing people. I like doing it. I've thought about it for a while. So the motive was clear. He clearly states that these were random people, and he just liked killing people and building bombs.
When we try to look at any outside influences, trying to determine why he would have committed an act like this, we were able to establish at one point he had watched the Unabomber series. You know, wondering if that potentially had spurred his interest in following in Ted Kaczynski's footsteps, but we just don't know. It was a huge relief in the end when we were able to bring this to a resolution. Without question, video footage made this case for us. You know, we had the surveillance video footage of him buying these components at these different locations, and we were able to compare the name from the credit card to that master list of the Ford Ranger pickup truck registration records. But I feel like he escaped justice in a sense by self-detonating, because we didn't go through the process of having a trial. Those families never got their day in court.
Our brother, Stephen, he had my best interest at heart. So I could tell him whatever I was thinking, and he would give me the best advice he could give me that was not self-serving. Not having someone in your corner that loves you, that you can look up to and ask advice of, that's kind of depressing sometimes.
He took away my brother. He took away somebody I loved. He took away a piece of me.
I literally have to take it, I say one day at a time, but it's really one moment at a time. I feel blessed that God allowed me the time that I did. Do I feel like it was short? Yes, but the time that we had together, we had nothing but great memories. I am blessed that God allowed me to be his mother for the time that he was here.
We've got two separate victims that come from two different worlds. I don't know what kind of animal could do that. Who isn't the big guy?
On Oahu, there are stories that never fully settle into the public record, not because they are insignificant, but because they dissolve into the rhythm of everyday life before they can harden into widely recognized history. The case of Nadine Cam belongs to that category of lingering uncertainty, a name that surfaces in fragments rather than in complete narratives. It is not a case defined by a single definitive telling, but by the absence of one. In conversations that occur in passing, in lowered tones, and in moments where memory collides with speculation, her name appears briefly and then recedes again, as if the island itself refuses to hold it in focus for too long. What remains is not clarity, but a pattern of partial recollections. People remember hearing something, or knowing someone who mentioned it, or encountering the name in a context that was never fully explained. Over time, these fragments accumulate into something that resembles a story, yet never fully becomes one. The absence of resolution does not create silence. Instead, it creates a kind of echo, where every mention seems to point back towards something unresolved that still resists being fully articulated. The environment in which this case unfolded is important to understand, not because it provides answers, but because it shapes how questions are remembered. Oahu is a place where dense urban spaces exist alongside slower coastal rhythms, where neighborhoods can feel both tightly connected and widely dispersed at the same time. Information travels quickly through informal channels, yet it also fades quickly when it is not reinforced by official updates or visible developments. In such an environment, unresolved cases do not disappear, but they also do not remain fully present. They occupy a middle space between awareness and forgetfulness. The name Nadine Cam is attached to that middle space. It is spoken of without certainty, referenced without detail, and remembered without a complete timeline that anchors it firmly in public consciousness. What is known comes from scattered accounts that never fully align into a single coherent narrative. There is a sense that something happened, that an ordinary life was disrupted, and that the disruption was never fully explained. Beyond that, the structure of the story begins to break apart into gaps that no single source has managed to fill. Those gaps are not just informational, they are temporal. There are moments that are accounted for and moments that are not, and between them lies a stretch of time that remains unverified. In true crime contexts, such gaps often become the most significant elements of the entire case, not because of what is known, but because of what cannot be reconstructed. In this instance, the absence of continuity becomes a defining feature, shaping every attempt to revisit or retell what occurred. The last confirmed sighting of Nadine Cam is described in general terms within the available fragments of information. She was seen leaving a familiar location during the early evening, under conditions that did not initially appear concerning. There was nothing in that moment that suggested urgency or alarm, nothing that indicated a break from routine. It was an ordinary point in time that only later gained significance through hindsight. At the time, it passed without drawing attention, as most ordinary moments do. In the hours that followed, there was no immediate indication that anything was wrong. Her absence did not initially trigger alarm among those who knew her, a delay that later became an important factor in attempts to reconstruct the sequence of events. It was only after communication failed to continue that concern began to grow. That transition from normal absence to perceived risk is often difficult to define precisely, and in this case it unfolded gradually rather than abruptly. When concern finally reached a threshold that prompted formal reporting, the initial response followed established procedures. Information was gathered, timelines were documented, and individuals within her circle were spoken to in order to establish a clearer picture of her recent movements. At this stage, the focus remained on understanding whether the situation could be explained through ordinary circumstances. The possibility of miscommunication or voluntary absence was considered among the initial explanations, as is standard in early stages of such cases. However, as more information was collected, those early assumptions became increasingly difficult to maintain. The fragments of testimony and timeline reconstruction did not align cleanly. There were inconsistencies, not necessarily dramatic or immediately revealing, but enough to prevent a coherent narrative from forming. These inconsistencies did not point directly to a single explanation, but they introduced uncertainty into every attempt to define what had occurred. The investigation, as it developed, did not move in a straight line. Instead, it expanded outward, examining multiple possible directions without quickly narrowing toward a single conclusion. One area of focus involved personal relationships and potential interpersonal tensions, while another considered situational possibilities that might involve chance encounters or opportunistic circumstances. Each direction produced information, but none of it resolved into a definitive endpoint. The result was not convergence, but dispersion, a widening field of inquiry that made it increasingly difficult to isolate a central explanation. As time passed, the case began to shift in how it was perceived by the wider community. In the early stages, attention was more concentrated, with discussion occurring more frequently and concern more visibly expressed. But in Oahu, where daily life continues with consistent momentum, sustained attention is difficult to maintain in the absence of new developments. Gradually, the case of Nadine Cam moved from active discussion into intermittent recall, resurfacing only occasionally when circumstances or reminders brought it back into view. This pattern of fading attention does not indicate resolution. Instead, it reflects a different kind of persistence, where unresolved matters remain present but inactive, waiting for something to reactivate them. In this case, that reactivation did not occur in a decisive way. There was no definitive breakthrough that returned the case to the center of public focus. Instead, it remained in a suspended state, neither fully active nor fully forgotten. Within investigative contexts, such cases often enter a phase where active momentum slows significantly. This transition does not imply abandonment, but rather a shift in how resources and attention are allocated. Files are preserved, evidence remains stored, and periodic reviews may occur, particularly if new methods or information become available. Yet the immediacy of the investigation diminishes, replaced by a longer-term horizon in which the possibility of future clarity remains open but undefined. In the absence of resolution, narratives begin to form in informal spaces. These narratives are not anchored in verified evidence, but in the human tendency to construct meaning where certainty is unavailable. People speculate, reinterpret fragments, and attempt to bridge gaps in understanding with plausible explanations. Over time, these interpretations can take on a life of their own, circulating alongside the limited confirmed facts, without ever fully replacing them. The case of Nadine Cam exists within this dual structure, one layer composed of documented fragments and procedural memory, and another composed of informal reconstruction and communal speculation. Neither layer fully dominates the other, and neither provides closure. Instead, they coexist, reinforcing the sense that the story remains incomplete regardless of how many times it is revisited. What makes this case particularly enduring is not the presence of dramatic detail, but the absence of resolution. There is no final explanatory framework that ties the known elements into a complete sequence. Instead, there is only a series of points that do not fully connect, separated by intervals of uncertainty that resist interpretation. In this way, the case does not conclude so much as it pauses indefinitely, held in place by the limits of available information. As a result, the name Nadine Cam becomes less a reference to a single defined event and more a symbol of unresolved inquiry. It represents not only what is known, but also what remains unknown despite sustained attention and procedural effort. In the broader landscape of unresolved cases, it occupies a space defined by persistence without resolution, presence without closure. And so the narrative remains open at its edges, not advancing toward conclusion, but continuing to exist in fragments that resurface when circumstances allow. It is a case defined by what cannot be fully reconstructed and by the quiet persistence of questions that have not yet been answered. The life of Nadine Cam, as it appears through the fragmented recollections tied to the case, was not defined by public visibility or dramatic contrast. Instead, it was shaped by a kind of quiet regularity that often goes unnoticed until it is interrupted. She is described within the limited accounts as a young woman who maintained a private and steady rhythm of daily life, moving between work, home, and a small circle of familiar contacts. There is no indication within the available information that her life was marked by instability or unusual disruption. Rather, what emerges is a portrait of normalcy that only later becomes significant because of what followed. Her routines, as they are indirectly reconstructed, reflect the structure of many lives in urban Oahu, where personal space and communal familiarity coexist without necessarily intersecting in predictable ways. People may recognize one another in passing, share brief exchanges, or occupy the same environments without forming deeply intertwined relationships. Within this context, Nadine Cam's presence was neither particularly isolated nor especially prominent. She existed within the social fabric in a way that was visible enough to be recognized by those who knew her, but not so visible that her absence would immediately reverberate through a wide network. This balance between visibility and privacy is important in understanding how her disappearance later unfolded. In cases where individuals are highly embedded in large social networks, the absence of immediate contact is often quickly noticed. In contrast, when someone maintains a smaller and more contained circle of interaction, gaps in communication may take longer to register as unusual. In Nadine Cam's case, the available fragments suggest that her circle was limited enough that her absence did not immediately trigger alarm, a detail that later became significant in reconstructing the timeline of events. The last known portion of her routine is described only in general terms. She was seen in a familiar environment during the early evening, engaging in what appeared to be ordinary movement without signs of distress or urgency. There is no recorded indication of confrontation or interruption at that moment. The absence of abnormal cues contributed to the initial interpretation that nothing significant had occurred. It was, in every observable sense, a continuation of routine behavior. What followed was not an immediate recognition of disappearance, but a gradual realization shaped by missed contact and unanswered attempts at communication. This gradual shift is a recurring element in many unresolved cases, where the boundary between normal delay and concerning absence is not clearly defined in real time. In Nadine Cam's situation, the transition from routine silence to perceived concern occurred over a period that was not precisely delineated, but described as slow enough to delay immediate reporting. When attention eventually turned toward her absence, the first responses from those within her circle were cautious rather than alarmed. Initial assumptions leaned toward explanations that did not involve harm or intervention. These included the possibility of voluntary withdrawal from communication, misunderstanding regarding plans, or simple disruption of routine contact. Such interpretations are common in early stages of uncertainty, especially when there is no immediate evidence of distress or external disruption. However, as time passed without clarification, those initial explanations began to lose plausibility. Attempts to re-establish contact did not produce results, and the absence of confirmation created a growing sense of unease. It was at this stage that concern shifted from passive uncertainty to active reporting. The decision to involve authorities marked a transition point in the case, moving it from private concern into formal investigation. From the perspective of investigative procedure, the early phase focused on establishing a baseline of facts. This involved reconstructing known movements, identifying recent contacts, and determining whether any immediate explanations could account for her absence. Individuals who had interacted with her in the days leading up to the last confirmed sighting were interviewed in an attempt to build a coherent timeline. These interviews, as reflected in the broader pattern of the case, did not produce a unified narrative, but rather a collection of partial and sometimes non-aligned recollections. The lack of alignment among these accounts did not immediately suggest wrongdoing, but it did complicate efforts to define a clear sequence of events. Small discrepancies in memory, differences in perception, and variations in timing all contributed to a picture that resisted simplification. Investigators were left with overlapping but incomplete versions of the same time frame, none of which could fully account for the gaps that had emerged. In cases like this, the absence of physical or direct evidence that clearly indicates a specific outcome often forces investigators to consider multiple potential scenarios simultaneously. These scenarios may include voluntary absence, accidental disappearance, interpersonal conflict, or opportunistic external factors. In the case of Nadine Cam, the available fragments suggest that multiple lines of inquiry were explored, but none produced a definitive resolution. One area of focus involved examining her personal relationships, not because of confirmed conflict, but because interpersonal dynamics are often a key component in reconstructing last known movements. Investigators sought to understand whether there were any tensions, unresolved disputes, or recent changes in communication patterns that might provide context. The information gathered in this area, however, did not consolidate into a clear motive or identifiable point of escalation. Another area of inquiry examined situational possibilities, including whether her disappearance might have involved an unplanned encounter or external circumstance that left limited trace. These considerations are common in cases where no clear evidence indicates prolonged planning or structured intent. Yet in this instance, the absence of corroborating detail meant that such possibilities remained speculative rather than evidentially supported. As the investigation progressed, the challenge became less about identifying new information and more about interpreting incomplete information in a coherent way. The fragments of evidence did not contradict each other in a decisive manner, but they also did not align in a way that allowed for a single explanatory narrative. This state of partial consistency is often one of the most difficult conditions in investigative work, as it prevents both confirmation and elimination of key hypotheses. Within the community, awareness of the case followed a pattern of fluctuation. In the initial period after concern was raised, attention was more concentrated, with discussions occurring among those familiar with the situation and brief mentions appearing in local awareness channels. However, as time passed without visible developments, attention began to disperse. In environments where multiple social and informational currents compete for focus, sustained attention requires continuous reinforcement, which was not present in this case. As a result, the case gradually moved from active discussion into intermittent recall. It did not disappear entirely, but it no longer occupied a consistent space in public awareness. Instead, it resurfaced occasionally when referenced indirectly or when similar situations prompted reflection. This pattern of partial retention is common in unresolved cases that do not reach a clear conclusion or generate ongoing public updates. From an investigative standpoint, this shift in public attention often corresponds with a transition in case management. Active inquiry slows, not necessarily due to lack of interest, but due to the natural limitations of available information. Evidence is preserved, documentation is maintained, and the case remains open in procedural terms, but the intensity of active pursuit diminishes unless new information emerges. In the absence of resolution, interpretive narratives begin to develop outside formal investigative channels. These narratives are not based on verified findings, but on the human tendency to seek coherence in incomplete situations. People attempt to connect fragments, infer missing links, and construct plausible sequences that can accommodate the known elements. In the case of Nadine Cam, these informal interpretations exist alongside the official uncertainty, neither replacing nor resolving it. What remains consistent across both formal and informal perspectives is the absence of a definitive explanatory framework. There is no confirmed sequence that fully accounts for the transition from last known sighting to unresolved absence. There is no conclusive determination that ties together all known fragments into a single closed narrative. Instead, there is a persistent gap that resists closure, regardless of how many times the available information is revisited. Within the broader context of unresolved cases, this kind of ambiguity is not unusual, but it is often what allows certain cases to persist in memory longer than others. Cases that end with clear resolution tend to fade into historical record. Cases that remain incomplete continue to resurface, not because of new developments, but because of unresolved structure. The life of Nadine Cam, as it is understood through the limited available information, therefore becomes inseparable from the absence that follows it in the record. Her identity within this context is shaped not only by what is known about her, but also by what remains unknown about her final movements. The result is a portrait defined as much by absence as by presence. And so the narrative remains suspended, held in a state where known facts and unknown outcomes coexist without reconciliation. It is a case that continues to exist not through resolution, but through the persistence of unanswered questions that have yet to find a conclusion. The incident that would later be associated with the name Nadine Cam did not begin with a dramatic rupture or a clearly identifiable moment of crisis. Instead, it unfolded through a sequence of ordinary intervals that only gained significance in retrospect. According to the limited reconstructed timeline, the last confirmed sighting occurred in the early evening when she was seen leaving a familiar location in a residential area on the outskirts of Honolulu. At that moment, nothing about her behavior suggested distress or disruption. There were no reported signs of urgency, no visible indications that she was departing under unusual circumstances. It was, by all accounts available, an ordinary departure that blended seamlessly into the surrounding rhythm of the day. What makes such moments difficult in retrospective analysis is that they contain no inherent markers of significance. The human tendency to assign meaning after the fact transforms otherwise routine observations into points of narrative importance. In this case, the departure only became meaningful when subsequent absence reframed it as the last confirmed point of contact. At the time, however, it passed without attention, unnoticed as anything other than part of an everyday sequence of movement through familiar space. In the hours that followed, there was no immediate disruption in communication that would have triggered concern among those who knew her. The absence of contact was initially interpreted as unremarkable. In many social contexts, particularly in environments where informal communication is preferred over strict scheduling, gaps in interaction are not unusual. This normality contributed to the delay in recognizing that something might be wrong. The boundary between expected silence and concerning absence remained undefined for a period of time that would later become critical in attempts to reconstruct the sequence of events. As time progressed without communication, the perception of normality began to shift. Attempts to make contact were met with silence, and the absence of response gradually transformed from neutral expectation into uncertainty. This transition did not occur at a single identifiable moment, but rather through accumulation. Each missed response added weight to the possibility that something was not as it should be, until concern replaced assumption. The decision to escalate concern into formal reporting marked a turning point in the unfolding incident. Once authorities were notified, the situation transitioned from private uncertainty into structured inquiry. The initial phase of this inquiry focused on establishing a clear timeline of known movements and interactions. This involved identifying the last confirmed points of contact and reconstructing the immediate context surrounding them. At this stage, investigators worked with limited but foundational information. They confirmed the last known sighting, documented the time frame of reported communication, and gathered preliminary accounts from individuals who had interacted with her in the days leading up to her disappearance. These accounts provided a fragmented but necessary basis for understanding the sequence of events, even as they failed to form a complete narrative. One of the early challenges in reconstructing the incident was the absence of any clear indication of distress or confrontation at the last confirmed point of sighting. Without such indicators, the transition from ordinary movement to unexplained absence lacked a visible threshold. This absence of observable disruption complicated efforts to define the precise moment when the situation shifted from normal to concerning. As investigators expanded their inquiry, they encountered a series of inconsistencies in the available accounts. These inconsistencies were not necessarily indicative of deception or intentional obstruction, but rather reflected the natural limitations of human memory and perception. Different individuals recalled different details, and those details did not always align in terms of timing or sequence. When placed side by side, the accounts formed a pattern that was incomplete but not contradictory in a definitive sense. Instead, they created a landscape of partial overlap and unresolved gaps. In attempting to bridge these gaps, investigators explored multiple potential explanations. One line of inquiry focused on the possibility of voluntary absence, considering whether there might have been reasons for her to withdraw from communication without immediate explanation. Another examined interpersonal dynamics, seeking to identify whether any recent changes in relationships or interactions could provide context for her disappearance. A third considered situational possibilities that might involve unexpected external factors. Each of these directions was pursued with equal procedural seriousness, but none yielded a conclusive result. The absence of physical evidence pointing clearly in any one direction further complicated the situation. Without a defined scene or traceable sequence of physical indicators, the investigation relied heavily on testimonial reconstruction. This type of reconstruction is inherently limited, as it depends on memory, interpretation, and incomplete observation. As a result, the investigative picture remained provisional rather than definitive, shaped more by inference than by direct confirmation. As the early investigative phase continued, attention turned toward establishing whether any patterns could be identified within the known fragments. Investigators analyzed communication timelines, mapped reported movements, and attempted to align disparate accounts into a coherent structure. Despite these efforts, the resulting framework contained too many unresolved intervals to support a single explanatory narrative. The gaps between confirmed points of information remained too large to bridge with certainty. Within the broader community context, awareness of the incident began to fluctuate. In the immediate aftermath of concern being raised, attention was more concentrated, driven by uncertainty and the natural human response to missing information. However, as time passed without new developments, that attention began to disperse. In environments where multiple events compete for public focus, sustained attention requires ongoing reinforcement, which did not occur in this case. As a result, the incident gradually shifted from active discussion into intermittent reference. This shift did not indicate resolution, but rather a change in cognitive placement within collective memory. The incident remained present, but not continuously active. It resurfaced only when prompted by related events or by contextual reminders. This pattern of intermittent recall is common in unresolved cases where no definitive conclusion is reached and where the absence of closure prevents full integration into either resolved narrative or complete forgetting. From an investigative perspective, the transition into a slower phase of activity is a natural progression when immediate leads are exhausted. The case does not close, but active momentum diminishes. Documentation is preserved, evidence is maintained, and periodic reviews may be conducted, but the intensity of daily investigative focus decreases. This shift reflects not a conclusion, but a recalibration of expectations based on available information. As the incident moved further from its initial reporting phase, the structure of available knowledge remained unchanged. No new definitive evidence emerged to alter the established timeline, and no breakthrough information surfaced that could clarify the unresolved gaps. The case remained defined by its initial fragments, with no additional layers of certainty added over time. In the absence of resolution, interpretive attempts continued to emerge in informal contexts. These interpretations were not grounded in verified findings, but in the human need to construct meaning from incomplete information. People naturally attempt to fill gaps in understanding by forming plausible narratives, even when those narratives cannot be confirmed. In this instance, such attempts coexisted alongside official uncertainty, forming parallel layers of understanding that did not intersect in a conclusive way. Despite these informal narratives, the core structure of the incident remained unchanged. There was a last confirmed sighting, a subsequent period of unaccounted time, a failure of communication, and an investigation that did not produce a definitive conclusion. These elements form the stable framework around which all interpretations revolve, regardless of variation in perspective. What defines the incident most clearly is not what is known, but what remains unknown. The transition from ordinary activity to unresolved absence lacks a clearly defined mechanism. The sequence of events contains interruptions that cannot be fully bridged. The investigative process, while thorough within its constraints, did not yield a conclusive outcome. These absences of certainty are not peripheral details, they are central to the structure of the case itself. As a result, the incident exists in a state of permanent incompletion. It is neither resolved nor actively unfolding. It occupies a temporal position defined by suspension rather than conclusion. In this state, the available facts remain fixed, while interpretation continues to shift around them without altering their fundamental limitations. The case of Nadine Cam, as represented through this incident, therefore remains defined by its unresolved structure. It is a sequence that begins with ordinary movement, passes through unverified absence, and ends without closure. The absence of a definitive conclusion is not an addition to the story. It is the condition that shapes the entire narrative. The investigation into the disappearance associated with Nadine Cam began in a structured but uncertain environment, shaped by limited initial information and the absence of a clearly defined starting point beyond the last confirmed sighting. From the outset, investigators were confronted with a case that did not present obvious physical evidence or an immediately identifiable sequence of events. Instead, they were required to construct understanding from fragmented accounts, partial recollections, and temporal gaps that could not be easily reconciled. The first step in the investigative process involved formalizing the timeline. Detectives worked to establish a verified sequence of known movements, beginning with the last confirmed observation of her leaving a familiar location in the early evening. This moment served as the anchor point for all subsequent reconstruction efforts. From there, attention shifted to the hours immediately preceding and following that point, with the goal of identifying any anomalies or deviations from routine behavior that might provide context. Interviewing individuals within her known social and personal circle formed the next phase of inquiry. These interviews were conducted to gather information about recent interactions, communication patterns, and any potential changes in behavior or routine. The responses collected during this phase did not produce a unified narrative. Instead, they revealed overlapping but inconsistent recollections. Some details aligned in broad structure, while others diverged in timing, sequence, or interpretation. These inconsistencies did not immediately suggest deception, but they introduced complexity into the effort to reconstruct a coherent timeline. Investigators paid particular attention to the nature of her recent communications, attempting to determine whether there had been any noticeable shifts in frequency or tone. The available accounts did not indicate any clear pattern of distress or conflict that would have signaled an imminent disruption. However, the absence of such indicators did not provide clarity, as it left open multiple possible interpretations without narrowing the scope of inquiry. In cases where behavioral changes are subtle or absent, investigators often face increased difficulty in identifying potential triggers or warning signs. As the initial phase progressed, attention turned toward mapping physical movements within the broader geographic context of the last known sighting. This involved reviewing available environmental information and attempting to align reported observations with possible routes or destinations. However, the lack of precise data limited the effectiveness of this approach. Without confirmed directional indicators or consistent witness alignment, the reconstruction remained speculative in nature. One of the most persistent challenges in the investigation was the absence of a clearly defined incident scene. In many cases, physical locations provide critical anchors for forensic analysis, allowing investigators to identify traces, sequences, and interactions that occurred within a confined space. In this case, however, no such anchor was immediately identifiable. The lack of a specific location where a definitive event could be confirmed meant that the investigation remained spatially diffuse, spread across potential rather than confirmed environments. As a result, the inquiry relied heavily on testimonial evidence and indirect reconstruction. Witness accounts were carefully reviewed and compared, with particular attention given to consistency across independent recollections. While some elements of these accounts aligned broadly, none provided a complete or uninterrupted sequence of events. Instead, they formed a mosaic of partial observations that could not be fully integrated into a single narrative framework. Investigators also examined the possibility of voluntary absence, considering whether there might have been reasons for her to leave without immediate communication. This line of inquiry involved reviewing behavioral context, recent interactions, and any known circumstances that might suggest intentional withdrawal. However, No definitive evidence emerged to support or confirm this possibility. The absence of supporting indicators left this scenario within the realm of uncertainty rather than conclusion. Another line of investigation focused on interpersonal dynamics. Detectives sought to determine whether any recent relationships or interactions might have introduced tension or conflict that could be relevant to her disappearance. This involved careful review of communication patterns and reported interactions. While some minor inconsistencies were noted in recollections of timing and contact frequency, there was no clear indication of escalating conflict or identifiable rupture that could explain the subsequent absence. Situational possibilities were also considered, including the potential for unplanned or opportunistic external involvement. In the absence of evidence pointing toward a structured sequence of voluntary departure or known relational conflict, investigators had to consider broader scenarios. However, the lack of physical evidence or corroborating testimony limited the ability to advance these possibilities beyond theoretical consideration. As such, they remained part of the investigative landscape without developing into dominant theories. As time progressed, the investigation entered a phase characterized by diminishing returns on active inquiry. Most immediate leads had been explored, and no new substantial information had emerged to significantly alter the understanding of the case. This does not indicate cessation of effort, but rather a transition in investigative tempo. Resources were maintained, documentation continued to be preserved, and periodic reassessments were conducted, but the intensity of active field investigation naturally decreased. Within this phase, investigators often revisit earlier collected information in an attempt to identify overlooked details or reinterpret existing data in light of broader context. In this case, such reviews did not yield new definitive insights. The information already gathered remained consistent in its limitations, defined more by absence than by contradiction. The gaps in the timeline persisted, and the inconsistencies in witness accounts remained unresolved. The lack of forensic grounding further complicated long-term investigative efforts. Without physical evidence to anchor the sequence of events, the case remained dependent on interpretive reconstruction. This type of dependency introduces inherent uncertainty, as it relies on memory and perception rather than tangible traces. As time passes, the reliability of such sources tends to diminish, not necessarily in accuracy, but in clarity and completeness. As the investigation continued without resolution, the case gradually transitioned into a cold case designation. This classification reflects procedural status rather than conclusion. It indicates that active investigative momentum has slowed significantly, while the case remains open for review should new information emerge. Evidence is preserved, files are maintained, and the possibility of future re-examination remains present, but the immediate expectation of resolution diminishes. Within the broader investigative system, cases in this category are periodically revisited. Advances in methodology, changes in available technology, or emergence of new information can prompt renewed examination. However, in the absence of such developments, cases remain in a stable but unresolved state. The case associated with Nadine Cam followed this trajectory, entering a phase of procedural maintenance rather than active pursuit. Community response to the investigation reflected a parallel pattern of gradual attenuation. Initial concern and attention gave way to intermittent awareness, shaped by the absence of ongoing developments. Without new information to sustain focus, public attention naturally dispersed. The case remained present in memory, but no longer occupied a central position in ongoing discourse. Instead, it resurfaced only when contextual triggers prompted recall. Despite this decline in active attention, the absence of resolution continued to define the case's underlying structure. The unanswered questions remained unchanged, and the gaps in the timeline persisted without clarification. No definitive explanation emerged to unify the fragmented information into a complete narrative. The investigative record remained open, but incomplete. From a procedural standpoint, the most significant challenge remained the inability to establish a continuous sequence of events beyond the last confirmed sighting. Without continuity, all subsequent analysis rested on inference rather than confirmation. This structural limitation shaped every aspect of the investigation, influencing both direction and outcome. The case ultimately remained defined by its unresolved nature. Each investigative avenue explored contributed partial information, but none provided closure. The absence of decisive evidence, combined with inconsistencies in testimonial accounts and the lack of a defined physical scene, ensured that the case remained open-ended. In this state, the investigation exists as a record of sustained effort without final resolution. It reflects the procedural attempt to reconstruct events that resist full reconstruction. The limitations encountered are not unique to this case, but they are particularly persistent within its structure, resulting in a long-term state of uncertainty that continues to define it. The case of Nadine Cam, as reflected in the investigative process, therefore remains suspended within the boundaries of incomplete knowledge. It is maintained within official records, periodically reviewed, and preserved for potential future development, but it has not progressed toward resolution. It exists as an ongoing absence within the investigative archive, defined not by what has been conclusively established, but by what is yet to be determined. In the case associated with Nadine Cam, there was no traditional trial process, no courtroom proceeding that transformed the fragmented investigation into a structured legal narrative. Instead, what existed was a prolonged absence of judicial resolution, a condition in which the investigative process advanced to a certain point and then stabilized without reaching the threshold of formal prosecution. This absence of trial does not indicate resolution, but rather the limits of what could be established through available evidence and testimony. As the investigation progressed through its earlier phases, the central challenge remained the inability to construct a continuous and verifiable sequence of events. Without a complete timeline supported by physical evidence or corroborated testimony, the legal system could not transition the case into formal charges. The procedural requirements for prosecution depend on establishing a level of certainty that was not achieved in this instance. The fragmented nature of the available information prevented the formation of a legally actionable narrative. Detectives and investigators continued their work within the boundaries of evidentiary standards, attempting to determine whether any combination of testimony, circumstantial indicators, or reconstructed timelines could meet the threshold required for further legal action. Despite sustained effort, no configuration of available information produced a stable foundation for prosecution. The absence of direct evidence linking any individual or specific sequence of events to a confirmed outcome meant that the case remained within investigative status rather than judicial advancement. As a result, there was no formal filing of charges that would have initiated a court process. Without charges, there could be no trial, no presentation of evidence before a judge or jury, and no legal determination of responsibility. The case remained within the investigative domain, where conclusions are provisional and subject to revision, rather than within the judicial domain, where conclusions must meet standards of legal certainty. This distinction is critical in understanding the outcome of the case. In public perception, unresolved investigations are sometimes assumed to eventually lead to courtroom proceedings. However, the transition from investigation to trial requires a level of evidentiary clarity that is not always attainable. In this case, the absence of such clarity meant that the legal system could not proceed beyond the investigative stage. Throughout the period in which the investigation remained active, periodic internal reviews were conducted to assess whether the accumulation of information might eventually support legal escalation. These reviews involved re-examining witness statements, reanalyzing the timeline of known events, and considering whether new interpretive frameworks could reconcile existing inconsistencies. Each review, however, arrived at the same fundamental limitation: the evidence remained insufficiently cohesive to support formal prosecution. One of the central obstacles was the lack of a definitive point of origin for the presumed incident. Without a confirmed location or sequence that could be independently verified, it was impossible to construct a legally admissible narrative of events. The judicial system requires not only suspicion or probability, but a structured and supportable chain of causation. In the absence of such a chain, the threshold for trial cannot be met. Witness accounts, while valuable in shaping investigative understanding, did not achieve the level of consistency required for legal proceedings. Variations in recollection, differences in timing, and incomplete observations created a body of testimony that was informative, but not definitive. In legal contexts, such variability can weaken the ability to establish certainty beyond reasonable doubt, which is a necessary standard for prosecution. Additionally, the absence of physical evidence that could be conclusively tied to a specific sequence of events further limited the possibility of judicial advancement. Without forensic material to anchor the narrative, the case remained dependent on interpretive reconstruction. While such reconstruction is useful in guiding investigation, it does not always meet the evidentiary requirements of a courtroom setting. As time passed, the case gradually moved into a procedural holding state. This is not a formal closure, but rather a stabilization of investigative activity in the absence of new developments. Files remain open, evidence remains preserved, and periodic review remains possible, but the likelihood of immediate legal escalation diminishes without additional information. In this state, the case exists within the system, but does not actively progress toward trial. The absence of trial proceedings also shaped public understanding of the case. In many instances, legal proceedings provide a sense of narrative closure, even when outcomes are complex or unresolved in emotional terms. Without such proceedings, the case remains structurally open-ended, defined by absence rather than conclusion. This contributes to the persistence of uncertainty within community memory. Over time, discussions surrounding the case shifted away from expectations of judicial resolution and toward broader acknowledgement of its unresolved status. The absence of charges or court proceedings became part of the defining structure of the case itself. Rather than being viewed as a step toward resolution that had yet to occur, it was increasingly understood as a case that had not reached the threshold required for judicial resolution at all. Within the investigative framework, this outcome is not uncommon in cases where evidence remains fragmented and inconclusive. The legal system is designed to act on certainty, or at least on a structured level of probability that can be presented and tested in court. When that structure cannot be established, the system must remain within the investigative domain, regardless of the duration or intensity of inquiry. In the case of Nadine Cam, this structural limitation became the defining feature of its judicial status. The investigation did not produce a transition into prosecution, and without prosecution, there was no trial phase. The absence of courtroom proceedings is therefore not an omission but a reflection of the evidentiary boundaries encountered during the investigative process. Despite the lack of trial, the case remained formally active within investigative records. This means that it was not closed or dismissed, but rather maintained in a state of readiness for potential future development. Should new evidence emerge that alters the evidentiary landscape, the case could theoretically transition into a new phase. However, in the absence of such developments, it remains in its unresolved procedural condition. This condition underscores an important aspect of investigative and judicial systems. Not all cases progress through every stage of legal resolution. Some remain indefinitely within investigative boundaries, shaped by the limits of available information rather than by procedural failure or conclusion. The absence of trial does not necessarily reflect a lack of effort, but rather a lack of sufficient evidentiary structure to support legal escalation. In this case, the investigative record reflects sustained effort, repeated analysis, and careful review of available information. However, each of these efforts ultimately return to the same constraint: the inability to construct a complete and legally defensible narrative. Without that foundation, the transition to trial could not occur. As a result, the case remains defined by its absence of judicial resolution. There is no verdict, no formal determination of responsibility, and no courtroom record that concludes the narrative. Instead, there is only the investigative file, preserved and periodically reviewed, but never advanced into formal adjudication. This absence shapes the way the case is understood both within official systems and in broader public perception. It stands as an example of a situation in which investigative processes reach their limits without transitioning into judicial resolution. The result is a permanent state of procedural incompletion, where the case exists within the system but does not progress beyond a certain point. The case of Nadine Cam therefore remains within this unresolved judicial space. It is neither dismissed nor adjudicated, neither closed nor resolved. It exists as an ongoing investigative record without a corresponding trial, defined by the absence of legal conclusion rather than by any formal determination. In the aftermath of the unresolved investigation associated with Nadine Cam, what remains most prominent is not a conclusion, but a sustained absence that continues to shape how the case is remembered, referenced, and interpreted. Without a trial, without a definitive judicial outcome, and without a complete reconstruction of events, the case exists in a condition defined by incompletion. This incompletion does not fade over time in the way resolved cases often do. Instead, it persists in a quieter form, resurfacing intermittently in memory, conversation, and archival reference. Within the community where the events were first reported, the passage of time has not produced closure so much as attenuation. The initial period of attention, marked by uncertainty and concern, gradually gave way to quieter acknowledgement. People continued to recognize the name, but less frequently in direct connection with active events and more often as part of a broader category of unresolved cases. In this way, the case transitioned from immediate relevance into a kind of background memory, present but not continuously active. This shift is significant because it reflects how unresolved cases evolve within collective awareness. When a case reaches resolution, whether through legal judgment or a clear factual conclusion, it is often integrated into a completed narrative structure. It has a beginning, a development, and an end. However, when a case remains unresolved, it resists that structure. Instead of a clear endpoint, it leaves behind a gap that cannot be fully integrated into narrative closure. That gap remains open, even as attention to it diminishes. For those closest to the investigation, the absence of resolution carries a different weight. Investigative closure is not merely procedural, it also provides cognitive and emotional finality. Without it, the process remains suspended. Files can be archived, reviews can be paused, and active inquiry can slow, but the underlying uncertainty remains unchanged. In the case of Nadine Cam, this uncertainty persists in the investigative record as an unresolved condition rather than a concluded event. Over time, the case has also become part of a broader pattern of similar unresolved investigations within the region. It is not unique in its lack of resolution, but it is distinctive in how it continues to circulate at the edge of memory without fully re-entering active discourse. It is referenced occasionally, not as a current event, but as an example of a case that did not reach closure. In this way, it has shifted from a specific investigative subject into a symbolic reference point for incompletion. The absence of a final determination has also shaped how the case is interpreted in informal discussions. In the absence of confirmed outcomes, people naturally attempt to construct meaning through partial narratives. These narratives do not replace official findings, but they coexist alongside them. They reflect attempts to reconcile uncertainty rather than assertions of fact. Over time, however, these informal interpretations often become detached from their original context, circulating as independent fragments of speculation rather than structured analysis. Despite these layers of informal interpretation, the official record remains unchanged. There is no confirmed resolution, no judicial determination, and no evidentiary breakthrough that has altered the fundamental structure of the case. The investigative file remains intact, preserved within procedural systems, and periodically subject to review. However, these reviews have not produced new conclusions or redefined the understanding of the case in any substantive way. In examining the long-term impact of unresolved cases such as this, it becomes clear that their significance lies not only in what is known, but in what remains unknown. The absence of resolution creates a structural condition in which interpretation continues without closure. This condition allows the case to persist in memory, not as a completed event, but as an ongoing absence within the historical and investigative record. The case of Nadine Cam exemplifies this condition. It is defined not by a final determination, but by the absence of one. The known elements of the case are limited, and they do not form a complete narrative arc. Instead, they exist as points within a fragmented structure that has not been fully connected. The spaces between these points are as significant as the points themselves because they represent the limits of what has been established. From an investigative perspective, the case remains a record of effort constrained by evidentiary boundaries. All available procedures were applied within the limits of the information provided. Witness accounts were gathered, timelines were reconstructed, and potential scenarios were examined. Yet each of these efforts encountered the same structural limitation: the inability to transform fragmented data into a continuous, verifiable sequence of events. Without that continuity, resolution remained out of reach. This limitation does not indicate failure in a procedural sense. Rather, it reflects the inherent constraints of investigative work when confronted with incomplete or insufficiently connected information. Not all cases can be resolved through available methods, even when those methods are applied thoroughly and systematically. In such situations, the investigative process reaches a point where further progress depends not on reinterpretation of existing material, but on the emergence of new and substantive information. In this case, no such information has emerged to alter the established understanding. The investigative record remains static, defined by its last confirmed points and its unresolved gaps. The absence of change over time reinforces the case's status as an open but inactive file, maintained within the system, without progression toward resolution. For the broader public, this state of incompletion has a different effect. Over time, attention naturally shifts toward new events, and older unresolved cases recede from active awareness. However, they do not disappear entirely. Instead, they persist in peripheral memory, reactivated occasionally through reference or similarity to new circumstances. In this way, the case continues to exist within a cycle of partial recall and partial forgetting. This cycle contributes to the enduring presence of a case, even in the absence of new developments. It remains accessible in memory, but not fully active in attention. It is neither forgotten nor resolved, but suspended in a state that allows it to reemerge when context makes it relevant again. This suspended condition is one of the defining characteristics of long-term unresolved cases. The absence of closure also shapes how the case is understood in reflective analysis. Without a definitive endpoint, interpretation remains open-ended. Analysts, observers, and those familiar with the case are left to consider not only what is known, but also the structural reasons why resolution was not achieved. This includes examining limitations in available information, constraints in investigative reach, and the inherent unpredictability of certain types of events. Ultimately, the case of Nadine Cam remains defined by its unresolved structure. It is a record without conclusion, a sequence without completed continuity, and an investigation that reached its procedural limits without transitioning into final resolution. It exists within the space between knowledge and absence, where facts are present but incomplete, and where the absence of closure becomes the defining characteristic of the narrative itself. Even as time continues to pass, that structure does not change. The case remains preserved in its incomplete form, neither closed nor advanced, but maintained as an unresolved record within both investigative systems and collective memory. In this way, its most enduring feature is not what has been established, but what continues to remain unknown. In the continued absence of resolution, the case associated with Nadine Cam gradually settled into a long-term investigative and social condition defined by permanence, without progression. This phase did not involve new developments or sudden changes in direction, but rather a steady stabilization of unresolved status. The investigative file remained open, preserved within official systems, while the broader public perception shifted into a quieter form of acknowledgement. The case was no longer actively unfolding, yet it was also not concluded. It existed in a suspended state that neither advanced nor closed. Within investigative practice, this stage is often the most structurally stable, yet narratively incomplete. Once all immediate leads have been exhausted and no new evidence emerges, cases enter a maintenance phase. In this phase, the primary activity consists of preservation, periodic review, and readiness for potential reactivation. The case of Nadine Cam followed this pattern. The documentation remained intact, witness statements were archived, and all collected materials were retained for future reference. However, no new investigative momentum developed to alter the foundational understanding of the case. The absence of new evidence over time reinforced the structural limitations that had already defined the investigation. The known timeline remained anchored to the last confirmed sighting, and everything beyond that point remained unverified. This fixed structure became the framework within which all subsequent interpretation occurred. Without additional data points, the investigative narrative could not expand, and without expansion, it could not move toward resolution. In parallel with this procedural stabilization, the case also underwent a transformation in public perception. As time passed, immediate attention diminished, replaced by intermittent recognition. The name Nadine Cam no longer appeared in active discussions as a current event, but rather as part of a broader category of unresolved cases that occasionally resurfaced in conversation. This transition from active awareness to peripheral memory is a common trajectory in cases without resolution. Despite this decline in active attention, the case did not disappear from collective memory. Instead, it became embedded in a quieter form of recall, one that is activated only under specific conditions, such as when similar cases emerge or when retrospective discussion of unresolved investigations occurs. In this sense, the case remains present, but not continuously active. It exists in a state of latent awareness. From an investigative standpoint, periodic reviews of the case continued to occur. These reviews involved re-examining existing materials to determine whether any overlooked detail might provide new insight. Witness statements were revisited, timelines were reassessed, and prior interpretations were reconsidered in light of accumulated experience. However, each review returned to the same structural limitation, the absence of new, substantive evidence. Without additional input, reinterpretation could not produce a fundamentally different outcome. One of the key challenges in this phase was the persistence of unresolved gaps within the timeline. These gaps were not simply missing pieces of information. They represented entire segments of time that could not be reliably reconstructed. In investigative terms, such gaps create a boundary condition that limits the scope of analysis. Any attempt to bridge them relies on inference rather than confirmation, and inference alone is insufficient to establish certainty. As a result, the case remained defined by discontinuity. The last confirmed sighting stood as a fixed point, while everything beyond it existed in a state of uncertainty. This discontinuity prevented the formation of a complete narrative arc. Without continuity, there can be no transition from beginning to resolution, only a series of disconnected segments that resist integration. Within this structural limitation, investigators also revisited earlier lines of inquiry to assess whether alternative interpretations might yield new understanding. These included considerations of interpersonal context, behavioral patterns, and situational possibilities. However, none of these avenues produced additional evidence that could alter the foundational constraints of the case. The absence of corroborating material meant that each interpretive path ultimately returned to the same unresolved core. Over time, this repeated return to the same structural boundary contributed to a gradual stabilization of expectations within the investigative process. The case was no longer viewed as actively progressing toward resolution, but rather as a record maintained in anticipation of potential future development. This does not imply abandonment, but rather an acknowledgement of current limitations. In the broader context of unresolved investigations, cases such as this often serve as reference points for understanding the limits of procedural systems. They illustrate how investigations can proceed thoroughly and methodically without necessarily reaching closure. The presence of such cases highlights the distinction between investigative effort and investigative resolution. Effort can be sustained indefinitely, but resolution depends on the availability of sufficient and coherent evidence. For the community, The long-term presence of an unresolved case creates a different kind of memory structure. It does not function as a concluded story, but as an open reference point that can be revisited without resolution. This type of memory is inherently unstable in narrative terms because it lacks closure. As a result, it persists in fragments rather than as a unified account. The case of Nadine Cam exemplifies this dynamic. It exists simultaneously as a documented investigative file and as a fragmented element of public memory. Neither domain provides closure, but both preserve the case in different forms. The investigative domain preserves structure and detail, while the public domain preserves recognition and partial recollection. Together, they maintain the case in a dual state of preservation without resolution. As years pass, the absence of new developments further solidifies this condition. Without additional evidence, the case cannot progress beyond its current boundaries. It remains fixed at the point where investigative momentum ceased to produce new direction. This fixation does not erase the case, but it does define its limits within both procedural and narrative systems. In examining the long-term trajectory of such cases, it becomes evident that their defining characteristic is not the presence of unanswered questions alone, but the persistence of those questions without resolution. Questions that remain open over extended periods become structural elements of the case itself. They are no longer simply inquiries awaiting answers, but defining features of the unresolved condition. Within this framework, the case of Nadine Cam remains unchanged. It continues to exist as an unresolved investigative record, maintained within official systems and preserved within collective memory. It has not advanced toward resolution, nor has it been formally closed. Instead, it persists in a stable state of incompletion, defined by the absence of definitive conclusion. This condition is unlikely to change without the emergence of new and substantive information capable of bridging the existing gaps in the timeline. Until such information appears, the case will remain within its current state of procedural suspension. It is neither active in pursuit of resolution nor closed in conclusion. It exists as a maintained absence within the investigative record. And so the case continues in this form, defined not by what has been conclusively established, but by what remains unresolved. As the case associated with Nadine Cam continued to exist without resolution, it entered a stage where time itself became one of the most influential factors shaping its meaning. Unlike the early phases of an investigation, where each day can bring new developments, later stages are defined by the absence of change. Days extend into months, months into years, and with each passing interval, the structure of the case remains largely the same. This passage of time does not resolve uncertainty. Instead, it deepens it by increasing the distance between the known events and the present moment. One of the most significant effects of time on an unresolved case is the gradual erosion of clarity. Witnesses who once recalled details with relative confidence may find those memories becoming less precise. The edges of recollection soften, timelines blur, and distinctions between direct observation and later interpretation become harder to maintain. In the case of Nadine Cam, where the investigation already relied heavily on fragmented testimony rather than definitive physical evidence, this erosion further complicated the possibility of future reconstruction. Investigators are aware of this dynamic and often attempt to mitigate it through early documentation and repeated review. Statements are recorded, timelines are fixed in written form, and key observations are preserved as close to their original articulation as possible. However, even with such measures in place, the passage of time introduces a level of uncertainty that cannot be entirely controlled. The preserved record remains stable, but the human context surrounding it continues to shift. In parallel with the fading precision of individual memory, the broader context in which the case exists also changes. Communities evolve, individuals move away, and the social networks that once provided context for the investigation become less accessible. In Oahu, where communities are both interconnected and fluid, these changes can occur gradually but significantly. People who once had proximity to the case may no longer be present, and new residents may have little awareness of events that occurred years earlier. This transformation of context affects not only the availability of information but also the continuity of attention. Cases that remain unresolved for extended periods often lose their immediate connection to the present. They become historical in nature, even if they are not formally closed. The case of Nadine Cam illustrates this transition, as it moved from being an active concern within a specific time frame to becoming part of a broader historical pattern of unresolved investigations. Despite this shift, the case does not disappear. Instead, it occupies a different position within collective awareness. It is no longer part of ongoing discussion, but it remains accessible as a reference point. When conversations turn to unresolved cases, when comparisons are drawn, or when similar events occur, the name resurfaces. In these moments, the case re-enters awareness briefly, before returning to its latent state. This pattern of intermittent recall is one of the defining characteristics of long-term unresolved cases. They do not maintain continuous visibility, but they do not fade entirely. Their presence is cyclical, shaped by external triggers rather than internal developments. In the absence of new information, the case remains static, but its visibility fluctuates based on context. From an investigative perspective, the passage of time also introduces the possibility of future re-examination. Advances in technology, changes in investigative methodology, or the emergence of new information can potentially alter the trajectory of a case that has remained unresolved for years. Evidence that was once inconclusive may be reanalyzed using improved techniques, and previously unconnected details may be reconsidered within new frameworks. However, the possibility of such re-examination depends on the existence of preserved evidence and the emergence of new analytical tools or information. In cases where physical evidence is limited or absent, the scope of reanalysis may be constrained. In the case of Nadine Cam, the lack of a clearly defined physical framework means that any future re-examination would likely rely on reinterpretation of existing records rather than the introduction of new material evidence. This limitation does not eliminate the possibility of resolution, but it does shape the conditions under which resolution might occur. It suggests that any significant development would likely require the introduction of new information from outside the existing investigative record, rather than the reinterpretation of what is already known. Within the broader landscape of unresolved cases, this creates a category defined by low probability of spontaneous resolution but sustained potential for change under specific conditions. The case remains open, not because resolution is imminent, but because it is still theoretically possible. This distinction is subtle but important, as it separates unresolved cases from closed ones in both procedural and conceptual terms. For the public, the long-term presence of such cases contributes to a broader understanding of uncertainty within systems that are otherwise associated with resolution and order. Investigative and legal systems are often perceived as mechanisms that produce definitive outcomes. However, cases like this illustrate that there are limits to what can be determined, even with sustained effort and structured methodology. This realization does not diminish the importance of investigative work, but it does highlight its boundaries. Not all sequences of events can be fully reconstructed, and not all questions can be answered within the available framework of evidence and procedure. In these instances, the absence of resolution becomes part of the case itself, rather than a temporary condition awaiting correction. The case of Nadine Cam remains within this category. It has not been resolved, but it has also not been abandoned. It continues to exist within official records, subject to preservation and periodic review. At the same time, it exists within collective memory as a reference point for unresolved inquiry, a name associated not with a completed narrative, but with an ongoing absence. As time continues to pass, the structure of the case is unlikely to change without external intervention. The known elements will remain fixed, and the unknown elements will persist as gaps within the narrative. The balance between these two conditions defines the case in its current form. In this sense, the case does not move forward in a traditional narrative sense. It does not progress toward resolution or conclusion. Instead, it remains in place, held within the boundaries established by the available information. The passage of time adds distance, but not clarity. And so the case endures, not as an evolving story, but as a stable record of unresolved inquiry. Its defining characteristic is not the presence of definitive answers, but the persistence of unanswered questions that continue to exist without resolution. As the years continued to extend beyond the initial investigation, the case associated with Nadine Cam gradually assumed a different kind of presence, one that existed less in active inquiry and more in the quiet persistence of unresolved absence. At this stage, the case was no longer defined by what investigators were doing, but by what could no longer be done within the constraints of the available information. It had reached a point where its structure was no longer evolving, and yet it remained open, a paradox that often characterizes cases that resist resolution. One of the most notable developments in this phase was the way the case became integrated into a broader conceptual understanding of uncertainty within investigative systems. It was no longer considered in isolation, but rather as part of a pattern that included other unresolved cases. In this context, it served as an example of how investigations can reach a point of procedural completion without achieving narrative closure. The distinction between these two forms of completion is significant. Procedural completion refers to the exhaustion of available investigative avenues, while narrative closure refers to the establishment of a coherent and definitive account of events. In this case, the former had been reached, while the latter remained unattainable. This distinction influenced not only how the case was understood by those within investigative frameworks, but also how it was perceived by the broader public. For those outside the formal system, the absence of closure often creates a sense of incompleteness that invites interpretation. Without a definitive account, individuals construct their own frameworks of understanding, drawing on partial information, assumptions, and the human tendency to seek patterns. These interpretations vary widely and often lack the evidentiary grounding required for formal acceptance, yet they play a role in shaping the informal narrative surrounding the case. Over time, these informal narratives can become layered, with different interpretations coexisting without resolution. In the absence of a definitive account, no single interpretation can fully displace the others. Instead, they persist as parallel possibilities, each reflecting a different attempt to reconcile the same incomplete set of facts. This multiplicity of interpretation is a direct consequence of the case's unresolved status, and it contributes to its enduring presence within collective memory. Within official records, however, the case remains unchanged. The investigative file continues to reflect the same structure it reached when active inquiry slowed. The known elements are documented, the unknown elements are acknowledged, and the boundaries between them remain fixed. This stability is not a sign of resolution, but rather a reflection of the absence of new information capable of altering the existing framework. The persistence of this structure over time reinforces the idea that certain cases exist beyond the reach of conventional resolution. This does not imply that they are unsolvable in an absolute sense, but rather that the conditions required for their resolution have not been met and may not be met within the foreseeable future. In such cases, the investigative process transitions from active pursuit to long-term maintenance, preserving the possibility of future development while acknowledging the limitations of the present. For those who engage with the case at a reflective level, this condition raises broader questions about the nature of certainty and the limits of knowledge. It highlights the gap between what can be known and what remains beyond verification, even in systems designed to uncover truth. This gap is not unique to this case, but it is particularly visible here due to the absence of a concluding event that would otherwise define the narrative. The case of Nadine Cam thus becomes not only an individual instance of unresolved investigation, but also a point of reference for understanding how uncertainty functions within structured systems. It illustrates how the absence of resolution can become a defining characteristic, shaping both the internal structure of the case and its external perception. As time continues to pass, the likelihood of spontaneous resolution diminishes, but it does not disappear entirely. The possibility remains contingent on the emergence of new information, whether through previously unknown witnesses, newly discovered evidence, or advances in investigative techniques. However, in the absence of such developments, the case remains in its current state, defined by the coexistence of known facts and persistent gaps. This coexistence creates a form of stability that is distinct from closure. It is a stability based on the absence of change rather than the presence of resolution. The case does not evolve, but it also does not conclude. It remains fixed within the parameters established by its last significant developments, neither advancing nor receding. Within the community, this stability manifests as a form of quiet acknowledgement. The case is recognized, but not actively discussed. It is remembered, but not continuously examined. It exists in a space between presence and absence, where it is neither fully integrated into ongoing discourse nor entirely removed from awareness. This position allows the case to persist over long periods without losing its identity. It remains identifiable as a specific instance, even as the details surrounding it become less prominent. The name itself becomes a reference point, associated with the concept of unresolved disappearance rather than with a fully articulated sequence of events. From an analytical perspective, the enduring nature of such cases underscores the importance of understanding not only how investigations succeed, but also how they reach their limits. It highlights the role of evidence, timing, and circumstance in determining the trajectory of a case. It also emphasizes that resolution is not solely a function of effort, but of the availability and coherence of information. In the absence of these conditions, the investigative process can only proceed to a certain point. Beyond that point, it transitions into preservation rather than progression. The case remains open, but it no longer moves forward in a conventional sense. The case of Nadine Cam remains within this framework. It is preserved within official systems, acknowledged within collective memory, and defined by the absence of resolution. Its structure has remained stable over time, shaped by the same limitations that constrained it from the beginning. And so it continues, not as a narrative that advances toward a conclusion, but as one that remains suspended, defined by what is known and what is not, and by the enduring presence of questions that have yet to be answered. In the extended trajectory of the case associated with Nadine Cam, the passage from active investigation into long-term, unresolved status ultimately transformed the meaning of the case itself. What began as an attempt to reconstruct a sequence of events gradually became an enduring example of how certain incidents resist full explanation. Over time, the focus shifted away from immediate questions of what happened and toward a broader recognition of what could not be definitively determined. This shift did not diminish the significance of the case. Instead, it redefined it within a different conceptual framework. At this stage, the case no longer functions as a developing narrative. There are no new chapters being added, no new sequences unfolding that alter its structure. Instead, it exists as a fixed record, one that has reached the limits of its current form. The known elements remain constant, anchored to the initial timeline and the last confirmed points of contact. The unknown elements remain equally constant, forming gaps that have not been bridged despite sustained effort. Together, these elements define the boundaries within which the case exists. This fixed structure has implications for how the case is interpreted over time. Without new developments, interpretation becomes less about uncovering new facts and more about understanding the limitations of existing ones. Analysts, observers, and those familiar with the case are left to consider not only the available information, but also the reasons why that information has not led to resolution. This reflective approach shifts the emphasis from discovery to comprehension, focusing on the structural conditions that prevent closure. One of the key factors in this dynamic is the role of absence. In resolved cases, presence is dominant. Evidence is presented, timelines are completed, and conclusions are reached. In unresolved cases, absence becomes equally important. Missing evidence, unverified timelines, and incomplete accounts take on a central role in shaping the narrative. In the case of Nadine Cam, these absences are not peripheral, they are fundamental to the case's identity. The persistence of these absences over time reinforces the sense that the case exists in a state that is both stable and incomplete. Stability arises from the lack of change, while incompleteness arises from the lack of resolution. This combination creates a unique condition in which the case is neither progressing nor concluding. It remains in place, defined by the same parameters that have existed since the investigation reached its plateau. Within investigative systems, this condition is managed through ongoing preservation and periodic review. Files are maintained, evidence is stored, and opportunities for re-examination are kept open. However, the absence of new information limits the effectiveness of these measures. Without additional input, the process of review cannot produce fundamentally new outcomes. It can refine understanding, but it cannot transform it. For the public, the case's long-term presence contributes to a broader awareness of uncertainty within systems that are often associated with resolution. It serves as a reminder that not all questions can be answered, even when they are pursued through structured and systematic means. This awareness does not diminish the value of investigative work, but it does highlight its boundaries. As the case continues to exist in this unresolved state, its significance becomes increasingly symbolic. It is no longer defined solely by its original context, but by what it represents within a larger pattern of similar cases. It becomes an example of how investigations can reach their limits, how evidence can remain insufficient, and how narratives can remain incomplete despite sustained effort. This symbolic dimension is reinforced by the way the case is remembered. Over time, specific details may become less prominent, while the overall impression of unresolved absence becomes more central. The name Nadine Cam becomes associated not with a fully articulated sequence of events, but with the idea of a case that did not reach closure. This association persists even as the details themselves fade from immediate recall. In this way, the case transitions from a specific investigation into a broader reference point. It becomes part of a conceptual landscape in which unresolved cases are understood not as anomalies, but as inherent possibilities within complex systems. This transition does not resolve the case, but it does change how it is perceived and integrated into collective understanding. From a structural perspective, the case remains unchanged. The investigative record continues to reflect the same combination of known and unknown elements. The absence of new evidence ensures that this structure remains stable, while the passage of time reinforces its permanence. The case does not move toward closure, but it does not disappear either. It persists as a fixed point within the investigative and historical record. The persistence of this fixed point raises broader questions about the nature of resolution itself. It suggests that resolution is not guaranteed, even when processes are followed and efforts are sustained. It highlights the role of contingency, the importance of evidence, and the limits of reconstruction in determining whether a case can reach a definitive conclusion. In the absence of resolution, the case remains open in a procedural sense, but closed in a practical one. There are no active developments, no new directions being pursued, and no immediate prospects for change. At the same time, the case is not formally concluded, leaving open the possibility, however remote, that new information could alter its trajectory. This dual condition, open yet static, defines the current state of the case. It exists within the system, but without movement. It is preserved but not progressing. It is remembered but not resolved. These characteristics combine to create a form of enduring incompletion that is both stable and unresolved. As time continues to extend beyond the original events, this condition becomes increasingly normalized. The case is no longer expected to reach resolution, yet it remains present as a possibility. It occupies a space in which expectations have adjusted to its unresolved status, while the theoretical possibility of change remains intact. Ultimately, the case of Nadine Cam stands as an example of how certain events resist integration into complete narratives. It illustrates the limits of investigative systems, the persistence of unanswered questions, and the ways in which absence can become a defining feature of a case. It remains within the record, unchanged in structure, yet enduring in its presence. And so it continues to exist, not as a story that concludes, but as one that remains suspended, defined by its unanswered questions and by the enduring absence of resolution that shapes every aspect of its narrative. In the prolonged existence of the case associated with Nadine Cam, There comes a stage where the meaning of the investigation is no longer tied to the expectation of resolution, but rather to the enduring presence of uncertainty itself. At this point, the case transitions fully into a long-term, unresolved condition that is both structurally fixed and conceptually open. It is no longer defined by active inquiry, yet it continues to exist as an unresolved question within both official records and collective awareness. This stage is marked by a quiet permanence. Unlike earlier phases, where each development carried the potential to alter the direction of the investigation, the current phase is characterized by the absence of change. The timeline remains as it was last established, the known details are preserved without expansion, and the unknown elements persist without clarification. This stability is not the result of resolution, but of the limits that have been reached in the absence of new information. Within investigative systems, this condition is managed through maintenance rather than progression. The case file remains intact, stored within official archives, accessible for review, but not actively evolving. Periodic reassessments may occur, but they do not produce new conclusions. Instead, they reaffirm the existing structure, confirming that the available evidence continues to support the same incomplete understanding. This repetition reinforces the case's status as unresolved, while also ensuring that it is not forgotten within the system. The persistence of this unresolved state also reflects the broader limitations of investigative processes. Even with thorough documentation, structured analysis, and sustained effort, certain cases reach a point where further progress is not possible without external input. This does not indicate a failure of procedure, but rather an inherent boundary within which all investigations operate. The case of Nadine Cam illustrates this boundary with particular clarity, as it remains defined by the absence of a critical element necessary for resolution. Over time, this absence becomes the central feature of the case. It is no longer simply a missing piece of information. It is the defining characteristic that shapes how the case is understood. The narrative is not built around a sequence of events that leads to a conclusion, but around the recognition that such a sequence cannot be fully constructed. The absence itself becomes the narrative. For those who encounter the case in later years, this structure influences how it is perceived. Without the context of active investigation, the case is understood primarily through its unresolved status. It is recognized as a situation in which questions remain unanswered, rather than as a sequence of events that can be fully traced. This perception reinforces the idea that the case exists in a different category from those that have reached resolution. Within the community, this distinction contributes to a subtle but persistent form of awareness. The case is not frequently discussed, yet it remains part of the collective memory. It is referenced occasionally, often in connection with other unresolved cases, and it serves as a reminder of the limits of certainty within otherwise structured systems. This form of awareness is less intense than the initial response to the case, but it is also more enduring. The passage of time further stabilizes this condition. As years accumulate without new developments, the expectation of resolution gradually diminishes. The case becomes less associated with the possibility of change and more associated with the persistence of its current state. This shift does not eliminate the theoretical possibility of new information emerging, but it does reshape how that possibility is perceived. It becomes less immediate, more abstract, and increasingly unlikely. Despite this shift, the case remains open in a procedural sense. It has not been formally closed, and it continues to exist within official systems as an unresolved investigation. This procedural openness ensures that the case can be revisited if new information becomes available, maintaining a connection between the present and the possibility of future development. However, in the absence of such information, the case remains static. This static condition also influences how the case is analyzed within broader discussions of unresolved investigations. It is often considered alongside other cases that share similar characteristics: limited evidence, incomplete timelines, and the absence of definitive conclusions. In this context, it contributes to a larger understanding of how and why certain cases resist resolution, highlighting patterns that extend beyond individual circumstances. From an analytical perspective, The case emphasizes the importance of recognizing the role of uncertainty within structured systems. It demonstrates that not all processes lead to definitive outcomes, and that the presence of unanswered questions can persist even when all available procedures have been followed. This recognition does not diminish the value of investigative work, but it does provide a more nuanced understanding of its capabilities and limitations. As the case continues to exist in this unresolved state, it also acquires a form of permanence that differs from that of resolved cases. Resolved cases are often defined by their conclusions, which provide a clear endpoint for both investigation and narrative. Unresolved cases, by contrast, are defined by their lack of such an endpoint. They remain open, not only in a procedural sense, but also in a conceptual one, continuing to invite interpretation without providing closure. This openness ensures that the case retains a degree of relevance, even as its details become less prominent. It remains part of the broader landscape of investigative history, contributing to ongoing discussions about uncertainty, evidence, and the limits of knowledge. In this way, its significance extends beyond its original context, becoming part of a larger framework for understanding unresolved events. The case of Nadine Cam exemplifies this extended significance. It is no longer defined solely by the circumstances of its origin, but by the way it continues to exist without resolution. Its structure has remained unchanged, its gaps unfilled, and its questions unanswered. These characteristics define its current state and shape how it is understood both within and beyond the investigative system. As time continues to pass, this state becomes increasingly stable. The absence of change reinforces the boundaries of the case, while the persistence of unanswered questions maintains its relevance. It remains present, not as an evolving narrative, but as a fixed point within the record of unresolved investigations. And so the case continues, defined not by what has been concluded, but by what remains open. Its enduring presence is a reflection of the limits of certainty, the persistence of absence, and the complex interplay between knowledge and uncertainty that shapes every unresolved investigation. In the final stage of reflection on the case associated with Nadine Cam, what remains most striking is not any single detail, but the enduring structure of absence that defines the entirety of the narrative. By this point, the case has long since moved beyond the possibility of immediate resolution and has instead settled into a form of permanence that is shaped entirely by what is missing. It exists not as a completed account, but as a sustained question, one that continues without answer despite the passage of time and the application of investigative effort. This condition invites a different kind of understanding, one that does not seek to reconstruct events in a linear sequence, but rather to examine the nature of incompletion itself. In resolved cases, the narrative is anchored by conclusions. There is a moment at which uncertainty gives way to determination, and the structure of the story becomes fixed. In this case, however, no such moment exists. The narrative remains open, defined by its inability to reach that point of closure. The absence of resolution has implications that extend beyond the boundaries of the case itself. It reflects the limitations inherent in systems that are designed to produce certainty. Investigative and legal processes operate on the assumption that evidence, when gathered and analyzed, will lead to a coherent understanding of events. While this is often true, cases like this demonstrate that it is not universally guaranteed. There are circumstances in which the available information is insufficient to support definitive conclusions, and in those circumstances, the system must contend with uncertainty as a permanent condition. For those who encounter the case in its current form, this uncertainty becomes the primary feature. The known elements provide context, but they do not form a complete picture. The unknown elements, by contrast, define the boundaries of what cannot be established. Together, these elements create a structure in which the absence of information is as significant as its presence. Over time, this structure influences how the case is remembered and understood. Without a conclusion to anchor the narrative, memory organizes itself around fragments rather than a continuous sequence. Certain details may remain recognizable, while others fade or become less distinct. The overall impression, however, remains consistent, a case that did not reach resolution, a question that was not answered. This pattern of memory reflects a broader tendency in how unresolved events are integrated into collective understanding. They are not forgotten, but they are not fully retained in detail either. Instead, they occupy a middle space, where recognition persists even as specificity diminishes. The case of Nadine Cam fits within this pattern, maintaining its identity while gradually losing the immediacy of its original context. Within investigative systems, the case remains preserved in a more structured form. Documentation ensures that the known elements are retained with precision, and periodic review maintains the possibility of future development. However, without new information, these processes do not alter the fundamental structure of the case. They preserve it, but they do not resolve it. This distinction between preservation and resolution is central to understanding the case in its current state. Preservation maintains the integrity of the record, ensuring that the case remains accessible and that its details are not lost. Resolution, by contrast, would require the introduction of new information capable of bridging the gaps that have persisted since the investigation reached its limits. In the absence of such information, the case remains preserved but unresolved. The persistence of this condition also highlights the role of contingency in investigative outcomes. Resolution often depends on factors that cannot be controlled or predicted: the availability of evidence, the timing of discovery, and the actions of individuals who may or may not come forward with information. When these factors do not align in a way that supports resolution, the case remains incomplete, regardless of the effort applied. In this sense, the case serves as a reminder that certainty is not an inherent property of investigation, but a result that depends on specific conditions being met. When those conditions are absent, uncertainty remains. This does not diminish the value of the investigative process, but it does define its limits. As the case continues to exist in this unresolved state, it also takes on a broader, symbolic significance. It becomes part of a larger collection of cases that illustrate the boundaries of knowledge and the persistence of unanswered questions. Within this context, it contributes to an understanding of how systems manage uncertainty and how individuals and communities respond to the absence of resolution. For the community, the long-term presence of such a case creates a subtle but enduring impact. It serves as a reminder that not all events can be fully explained, and that some questions remain open indefinitely. This awareness may not be at the forefront of daily life, but it exists in the background, shaping perceptions of certainty and doubt. At the same time, the case continues to exist as a point of potential change. Although the likelihood of new developments decreases over time, the possibility is never entirely eliminated. The preservation of the case within official systems ensures that it can be revisited if new information emerges. This possibility, however remote, maintains a connection between the present and the unresolved past. Ultimately, the case of Nadine Cam remains defined by its absence of resolution. It is a narrative without conclusion, a sequence without completion, and an investigation that reached the limits of what could be established. Its enduring presence reflects the persistence of unanswered questions and the ways in which uncertainty can become a permanent feature of a case. And so, it remains, not as a story that ends, but as one that continues without closure, held in place by the balance between what is known and what is not, and by the enduring absence that defines its entire existence. In the final extension of the case associated with Nadine Cam, the narrative reaches a point where continuation no longer implies progression, but rather endurance. What persists is not movement toward resolution, but the sustained presence of a question that has resisted closure across time. At this stage, the case exists not as an active investigation, nor even as a paused one awaiting imminent development, but as a fixed condition within both institutional memory and the broader landscape of unresolved events. It has become part of a category defined not by outcomes, but by their absence. This enduring condition transforms the nature of the case itself. Initially, it was an event, then an investigation, and later an unresolved inquiry. Now it stands as a structure, one that is maintained rather than developed. The distinction is subtle but significant. A developing case invites forward motion, suggesting that new elements may alter its course. A maintained case, by contrast, preserves what has already been established without generating new direction. It exists within boundaries that have proven resistant to expansion. Within those boundaries, the known details remain intact, unchanged by the passage of time. The last confirmed movements, the recorded statements, and the investigative efforts that followed are all preserved in their original form. They constitute a fixed framework, one that defines the limits of certainty. Beyond that framework lies uncertainty, not as a temporary gap to be filled, but as a persistent condition that has become integral to the case's identity. The persistence of this condition invites reflection on the nature of unresolved narratives. In most forms of storytelling, closure provides a sense of completion, allowing events to be understood as part of a coherent whole. In the absence of closure, however, the narrative remains open, resisting integration into a final form. This openness is not simply a lack of ending, it is a different kind of structure altogether, one that is defined by its incompleteness. In the case of Nadine Cam, this incompleteness is not the result of neglect or oversight, but of limitation. The investigative process reached a point where further progress depended on information that was not available. Without that information, the process could not advance, and the case remained in its existing form. This limitation is central to understanding the case, as it defines both its current state and its potential for future change. Over time, the case has also acquired a form of permanence that is distinct from resolution. Resolved cases are often remembered through their conclusions, which provide a clear endpoint for reflection and understanding. Unresolved cases, by contrast, are remembered through their persistence. They remain present not because they have been completed, but because they have not. This persistence ensures that they continue to occupy a place within both institutional records and collective awareness. The way the case is remembered also evolves over time. Specific details may become less prominent, while the overall impression of unresolved absence becomes more central. The name itself becomes a marker of incompletion, associated with the idea of a case that did not reach a definitive conclusion. This transformation reflects a broader pattern in how unresolved events are integrated into memory, where identity is preserved even as detail fades. Within investigative systems, the case remains subject to the same conditions that have defined it since the transition into long-term unresolved status. It is preserved, accessible, and open to review, but it is not actively progressing. The possibility of new information remains, but it exists as a contingency rather than an expectation. This balance between preservation and possibility defines the case's current position within the system. From an analytical perspective, the case highlights the interplay between evidence, time, and uncertainty. It demonstrates how the absence of critical information can prevent the formation of a complete narrative, even when other elements are present. It also illustrates how time can stabilize that incompleteness, transforming it from a temporary condition into a lasting feature of the case. This stabilization has implications for how the case is understood in a broader context. It becomes part of a collective understanding of the limits of investigative processes, contributing to a recognition that not all questions can be answered within the available framework. This recognition does not diminish the importance of seeking answers, but it does provide a more realistic understanding of what can be achieved. For the community, the case remains a quiet presence, one that does not demand constant attention, but does not disappear either. It exists in a space between memory and absence, where it can be recalled, but is not continuously engaged with. This position allows it to persist over long periods without losing its identity, even as its details become less immediate. The enduring nature of the case also reflects a broader human tendency to seek meaning in the absence of resolution. Even when definitive answers are not available, there is a continued effort to understand, to interpret, and to integrate the event into a larger framework of knowledge. This effort does not produce closure, but it does ensure that the case remains part of an ongoing process of reflection. Ultimately, the case of Nadine Cam stands as a representation of unresolved inquiry in its most sustained form. It is not defined by a single moment, but by the accumulation of time without resolution. Its structure has remained consistent, its boundaries unchanged, and its central question unanswered. These characteristics define its existence within both the investigative record and the broader landscape of memory. And so, it endures, not as a story that reaches an end, but as one that continues to exist in its original state, shaped by the balance between what has been established and what remains beyond reach, and defined by the enduring absence of a conclusion that has yet to emerge.